So Cole Stangler drops in from Paris and shares his observations on why the Yellow Vest movement is opposed to billionaires helping rebuild the Notre Dame Cathedral. It's fascinating. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, and subscribe to our channel. I wanted to get an update from France about what's going on there. The Yellow Vest movement is, I think, in many ways the French version of what might happen in the United States if the left did a Tea Party kind of thing. Although maybe Cole Stangler would disagree with me on that. I'd love to get his thoughts on it. And we can right now, in fact. Cole is on the line with us. His website, Cole Stangler, ColeStangler.com. You can tweet him also at Cole Stangler. Cole, welcome, and thanks for giving us a shout from Paris today. How's everything there?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me, Tom.
My pleasure. I understand that the Yellow Vest movement has been protesting the billionaires rebuilding Notre Dame, or Notre Dame. This has to be more complex than just that. What's happening with that movement?
Yeah, the most recent weekend here has been the 23rd straight weekend of these Yellow Vest protests, which is pretty remarkable. Protests started back in November of last year. They've now gone on, just had Act 23 and presumably another protest coming up in the following weekend. And this is all ahead of May 1st, which is Workers' Day. And we could expect a pretty large turnout there of both unions and probably the Yellow Vests as well. Now, it is important to note as well that in terms of the size of the protests, they have declined in a pretty substantial way, I would say. The support as well has declined a little bit. At the beginning of the protest, we had about 70% support in the polls in support of the movement. And now it's down to about 50%, about half the country. But I still think that's a significant number in France when you look at the popularity of major political figures, whether that's Emmanuel Macron, whether that's the far-right National Rally Party led by Marine Le Pen, whether it's the mainstream right-wing party. 50% support in France is a non-negligible figure. And sure. I think it speaks to how people continue to identify with the Yellow Vest protests, or at the very least have sympathy for this movement, which has really crystallized a lot of the opposition to Emmanuel Macron and frustrations that people have had with the general trajectory of French politics for the last couple decades, which that is ignoring the plight of working people, not investing enough in public services, and enacting policies that are designed to curry favor with the rich at the expense of the rest of the population.
So Macron has been pushing basically neoliberalism, good old generic neoliberalism.
Yeah, we've seen this. I think I've talked about this before on your program, but, his very first budget in office, Emmanuel Macron goes in and implements this massive tax cut for the super rich. And when I say the super rich, that really is the super rich, people making people with 1.3 million euros in assets. The wealth tax that used to exist in France, Macron repealed that, or put it so that it applies only to real estate assets. In any case, a very significant tax cut for the wealthiest fraction of French society, and that was really the signal for the rest of his policies. So,
speaking to the actual the Yellow Vest movement, I know, and I was kind of close to this, and so it was painful to watch. With the Occupy movement in the United States, that emerged as a consequence of the financial excesses and all this sort of thing. In New York City, good chunks of that Occupy movement got co-opted by the Bob-Avakian cult, basically, this political cult that operates under all kinds of different names. There were parts of the Occupy movement that were also, I know in Washington, D.C., one group that was basically co-opted by the, what's his name? The Lynn and LaRouche bunch, And it was like there were all these kind of fringe groups that have identified themselves as lefties. I mean, Bob-Avakian, that's the Revolutionary Communist Party, that basically took over in a relatively egalitarian movement here in the United States because it was leaderless, because or you could say that made it easier to take over. Is anything like that happening in France with the Yellow Vest movement?
Yeah, one of the things about the Yellow Vest movement, as you point out, is certainly it's extremely decentralized. It really depends on the location you're in. You can have the makeup of a group in say, the northeast of Paris can be very different from the makeup of a group in southwestern France or in the north of France, which is, more the historic mining areas of the country that actually have a lot in common with West Virginia and parts of the U.S. In any case, the movement does vary a lot, and so you do see some kind of fringe, radical, some far right involvement, but I would say overall, the movement has maintained its integrity. There are trade unionists that are involved more in certain parts of the country. There are left-wing activists that are more involved in certain parts of the country. So it really depends on what you're looking at. And I think it depends on, and it really depends on the city. Is really the answer to the question.
Yeah. So tell me about the Yellow Vest movement's response to the Notre Dame fire.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that happened, and in some ways for me, I think I tweeted this or something to this effect, but this horrible tragedy that happened at Notre Dame. I think everyone in the country was pretty shocked looking at these images, going to sleep not knowing if they were going to see the cathedral the next morning. And so it was a pretty traumatic moment, especially for all the history and the architectural marvel that is the cathedral. But in some ways, what was refreshing to me was the very next morning when you saw these donations that were coming in from some of France's wealthiest families, the Arnault family, which owns the LMVH luxury brand, the Pinot family, which owns another luxury brand holding company. These donations started pouring in, and I think now they're over 1 billion euros has been promised by these rich families. There was already criticism the next morning about these families ostensibly using the tragedy of Notre Dame to reduce their tax bill, because the next morning you had supporters of these families saying, it would be nice if the donations that they would be giving would be taxed less than at the current rate, and therefore reduce their tax bill. And so we saw this offensive from supporters of the families and immediate backlash and criticism from the rest of from a lot of people in France, and eventually I think we've reached the point now where those donations are going to just be regular donations, and they're not going to be provide any tax advantages. So what I was saying was it was actually refreshing in some ways to see the backlash in France, to say, you know what, this is upsetting, it's a tragic moment, but at the same time this shouldn't be used by people to advance their policy aims. And in fact, now the campaign for the European Parliament elections that are coming up at the end of May, from May 23rd to 26th, elections across Europe, that campaign was put on pause a little bit following the fire at Notre Dame, and we've seen right now this week so far the fury and the criticism and the electricity of the campaign is back and running again, and parties are once again criticizing each other. And that little brief moment of national unity was a flicker, and we're back to the regular grind of French politics, which is very people like to debate a lot and criticize each other.
No, I get that. Pulling back a little bit and looking at all of Europe, we see in countries like Poland and Hungary, right-wing governments taking power, authoritarian governments, nationalist governments, racist, essentially, governments. On the other hand, in Portugal, for example, you've got a very progressive government that defied the European Union's, the whole Eurozone thing, and said, no, we are going to engage in deficit spending to get ourselves out of a recession, and it actually worked. And, kind of giving a lie to the EU's neoliberal policies, frankly, that took down, in my opinion, Spain and Greece over the last decade. We've got this spectrum of political perspectives inside the European Union, from well, I've identified them, I guess. How is that playing out, not just in France but across Europe? What direction do you see the continent moving?
Yeah, it's a tough question, because I think it really depends on the national context. As you pointed out, in Portugal you have a coalition left-wing government that's in power. In the UK, with I don't know if we should include the UK as part of the discussion, although presumably for at least the next few months they are. The UK has its own specific context. France as well. In Spain, which was a flicker or Spain was certainly seen as a source of hope for a lot of people on the left. Around the same time as Syriza in Greece took power on their anti-austerity agenda, Spain obviously has Podemos, the left populist political party, and polls there are not looking very favorable for Podemos, although the socialists seem to be able to conserve their majority. But Spain seems to be a country that if at least the radical left or the populist left or Podemos doesn't seem to be on the verge of taking power, at least the center left is with the socialists. But other than Spain, it's kind of a dark picture if you look at some of the major economies and the major countries in Europe. So if you look at France, if you look at Italy and Germany, the three biggest countries in the EU in terms of both population and the economy, these are countries where the debate, and I wrote about this in a recent piece for Commonweal magazine, the debate seems, depressingly kind of stuck between this, on the one hand, defending the current order of the European Union with all of the harmful economic policies that implies, on the one hand, and on the other hand, this kind of far-right dominated xenophobic populism. In France, that's the National Rally Party, the former National Front. In Germany, you have the AfD. In Italy, you have the Lega Party, which is now in a coalition government. So
and Steve Bannon is getting his fingers into all of these, is he not?
He is, and I actually did report on that as well for a piece in a French outlet that came out a few weeks ago. And the interesting thing about Bannon's outfit there, and you can find this reported in English as well, is Bannon launched this movement which he called the Movement. That's the name of the group he formed with a small party in Belgium. And the idea was they were going to be spending money and providing polling assistance and doing data analysis for all these far-right populist parties across Europe. So the three parties I mentioned, and the AfD in Germany, National Rally in France, Lega in Italy. So this huge momentum around the start of the movement, and it turns out that actually there are real legal barriers to being able to provide foreign assistance, at least of that scope, in a lot of the European countries. So
that's interesting.
The movement does seem to be blocked, at least the way it was. It won't be able to achieve a lot of the objectives it set out from the beginning. But the far right is still on the ascendant, and it's a very frightening and kind of dark climate here.